right.
Hey everybody, welcome to Distance Learning with Harris yet again. I am so excited about today's guest. As someone I've admired their work for many years and didn't know it until just recently. But I have with us today Mr. Derek McLane, New York-based set designer, and does a lot of stuff. I'm going to let him talk about what he does and what he's done, and then we're going to ask him some questions, and I'll open it up for the floor for those of you who might want to ask questions. And so we're going to start with this. Mr. McLane, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and anything you find relevant to what we're talking about today, and then I've got some questions I can ask, and we'll go from there.
Sure. Well, nice to be here. I lived in New York. I moved to New York in 1984, and I started work as an associate set designer. I basically arrived from graduate school and called everybody I had ever heard of and asked if they needed an assistant, and eventually found something to get started on. And so I spent several years in New York working as an assistant designer when I first got here. I learned a lot, working in different people's studios, seeing how they, every designer I worked for had a different different way of approaching their projects, and also a different way of conducting business. Hanging out in their studios, I got to hear their phone calls, at least one side of them, and so that was also really interesting in terms of how people conducted themselves professionally. And that was definitely something that I had not ever picked up in school. So that was super useful. And eventually, I started to get my first little tiny off-Broadway shows or off-Broadway shows, which mostly entailed carrying furniture on the subway at rush hour. But eventually, over many, many years, I started to get some bigger jobs. And then I spent probably about 10 years working in regional theaters, traveling all over the country, designing, 12 to 14 shows a year in different parts of the United States. And that was its own kind of training in a way. I got to experiment really boldly. There was something about designing shows in towns where I didn't live, where I didn't have to really stick around and see the consequences. So I could just design something and be pretty bold about some of those experiments. And that was super useful for me. And then eventually sort of developed a New York career, but it took a very, very long time to get there.
So would you say those early experiments really kind of inspired your style or your creative process in some way?
There were a lot, some yes. I mean, there were a lot of experiments that I tried. Some of them worked and some of them didn't, to be quite honest. One of the things I discovered was I didn't ever want to do a bright yellow set again. There were things like that I'm glad I tried, but they really had various degrees of success. And also, I got to work with such a wide variety of people in such a huge variety of different theater spaces. They're more so in around the United States, you find sort of more unusual seating arrangements than you do in New York. Most of the New York theaters are sort of straight ahead proscenium spaces, but there's a lot of theaters, resident theaters around the United States that were built in the 70s that, where they were very interested in thrust theaters or theaters in the round. And so that's also interesting in terms of the types of spaces you get to work in.
So where are some places that you look for inspiration when you start a set design? Obviously script, but then where do you go from there?
It totally depends on the piece. I mean, some shows, the research is place-based. You look at research has to do with the location and the period, and I would say I usually do that type of research for every show anyway, whether or not the design is really going to look like that. I think it's always, it's a good place to look. But some plays, if I'm doing a contemporary play that takes place in a kind of middle class home, it's not the kind of thing you're likely to find a whole lot of beautiful research of. That doesn't usually inspire that many paintings. So then you sort of, to find the right piece of research, unless it's something that's I have access to in my own life. You end up looking in places like photography books. There's certain photographers that are interested in certain types of suburban life or middle class life. That can be more of a challenge to find. Sometimes sometimes you make phone calls to somebody you track down somebody who lives in a particular part of the country, and you ask, hey, could I hire you for a day to go take photographs, of this particular type of house or this particular type of living room? And, you ask them to actually literally go to their family's house or their neighbor's house and see if they could be given permission to take some photographs. That's, in a way, it's the sort of less interesting research that's more challenging. If you want that kind of level of accuracy. Some research you find, in books. Obviously, you can find almost everything on the internet, but the problem is finding it, because the internet has no point of view. It's all just random crap. Some of it's great, and most of it's terrible. And the advantage of art books and photography books and painting books or museum collections is that they're curated by somebody. Somebody's got a point of view, has actually made a collection of pieces of research. So that's sometimes, a lot of times what you're looking for when you start on a show is a point of view. What's the sort of take on it? It's not just literal images like the thing looks like this, but what's the sort of take on it? And that's where other artists' work, whether it's a photographer or a painter or a sculptor, is sometimes really super useful in terms of helping you sort of figure out what the take on something is. Traveling is sometimes great for research when that's possible. Actually, there's nothing like going to the place where some story happens, if that's possible. That's often not possible, but it just depends so much on the period and the time and what's accessible. Some things there's a load of images of. There's lots and lots of images of, and some things there's far fewer. And then sometimes you need research that's really not so much based on period or place or time, but it's really just inspiration. Something that will spark your imagination in an exciting way. And that there's no telling where that can come from. I mean, for me, it's often a museum, but sometimes it's a construction site I happen to see outside, or sometimes it's something that I remember seeing once upon a time and then trying to track that down. So different things.
So research, obviously, can you talk a little bit about that creative process, like how you maybe start with that and then that kind of goes into what you're thinking and where your designs come from? Can you walk us through that for a little bit?
Yeah, well, depending on what a director has to say about a story, usually I don't do all the research myself. I sometimes get some of my associates in my studio to help me with research, and so I might say, I'll give you an example. I did a play about a year and a half ago on Broadway called American Son, which took place in a Miami police station. And that proved to be kind of challenging to research because there's lots of pictures of Miami police stations, but they didn't really look like anything. It was really interesting. They were incredibly unremarkable. It was a lot of sort of sheetrock walls. They looked sort of suburban. New York City police stations have a very distinctive look. We know them all from television shows. And if you've ever been into one, you know that they kind of look like what they look like in the television shows. They're gritty. They tend to be about 100 or 150 years old. They're grimy as hell. they look well used. They look like they've been battered and beaten. And the Miami police stations were so modern and bland. It was hard to figure out how to make that look like anything. So I ended up, with the help of some of my associates, expanding that search to look for, so we weren't just looking at Miami. We said, well, let's look at police stations all over Florida, and let's maybe look in Georgia and Louisiana and other, places that are close by, and see if we could find something that actually looks like something. Sometimes, when people are doing research for you, they just give you, 1,000 images. Well, not 1,000, but they give you like 150 images, which are really, really dull. And so usually then I just say, give me, choose the 10 most eccentric, or the 10 most interesting, or the 10 most beautiful images you have, and let's look at those, rather than be a little selective about what it is we're looking at. So out of that, sometimes something will come. And then of course, if you're doing a lot of plays, especially single set plays, so much of that also comes out of the ground plan, and starting to develop the ground plan of the set. How does this need to work? Where in a building, or where exactly is this, and where do people have to come from? Are there any big entrances that are really important? Is there a sense of other rooms that you have to convey? Is there a logic to the floor plan of the rest of the structure that the audience doesn't see, but that has to be implied? So sometimes drawing that ground plan out will actually tell you something, even if the research isn't really telling you that much. You just start to draw the ground plan, and sometimes if you can actually just make a really interesting ground plan, that actually, floor plan can actually lead to a design that starts to get to be exciting.
So I guess it's a chicken or egg question. Is the ground plan come first, or does the rendering come first, I think? Can I show pictures of American Sun so we can see what we're talking about?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. I would say that it's really either. The ground plan is hugely important, but sometimes you just find a piece of research that's so compelling, you go, that's where I want to start. You go, that's the thing, that piece of research looks like where the play should take place, and now I'm going to work backwards from that. So a couple things about this play. It rains throughout the play, almost continuously throughout the play. There's rain, and so the director Kenny Leon and I thought it would be interesting to sort of feature that, to see the glass, see glass and see rain outside the windows. So that was one thing that was sort of important. Also, the other thing that's peculiar about this play, when you read it, is that there's only 4 characters in it. It's basically a mother and father who are in this police station looking for their son, and then there's 2 cops. And so they're in a police station in Miami in the middle of the night, and you never see anybody else. It's like you don't see any other cops, you don't see any other families, you don't see any suspects. So figuring out where in the police station this actually might be was sort of part of the challenge. And so we came to the conclusion that this was sort of a kind of ancillary, waiting room that was also used by cops. That was like a place that cops, almost like a cop's lounge, that was also used as a waiting room. It's not exactly where the front desk is. It's down the hall from the front desk of the police station. And then the other thing that I think with the floor plan to this was, there was really only 2 ways in and out. One was to the front desk, which is over on the right, stage left. And then the other was to the rest of the police station, which is over on the left, stage right. And so there's 2 hallways. And I ended up wanting to make this symmetrical because there's something about the play that has a bit of a feeling of Greek tragedy. So I wanted it to feel, I guess, both real and a little bit epic at the same time. And hence I went for this, completely symmetrical V-shaped ground plan, basically looking into the corner of this room, featuring the windows outside and the kind of the gray, gloomy rainstorm of a night that's going on out in Miami. So you don't ever really see any of Miami; you just see the rain, and that's really how that floor plan developed.
Very cool. So what's the biggest difference between designing for a musical and designing for a singular scene play?
Well, yeah, I mean, some plays are also move like musicals, I suppose, but it really depends. I mean, some musicals want to have a single set or a kind of unit set or, a really singular image, and some don't. But musicals tend to move more often than plays do. Not always true, but that's often the case. Musicals tend to have more transitions. Transitions in musicals are in some ways easier than transitions in plays because you have music built into a musical that helps move the scenery. I think it's really, really hard to move scenery in silence. And you need something to motivate it. So in a play, if you've got to do a transition, you either got to have a music cue, or you've got to figure out something else that sort of makes it feel like something that motivates the scenery. That's usually pretty easy in a musical because there's all that music built in, and that music can sort of drive the scenery. And the speed of the music, the tempo of the music will tell you how fast the scenery has to move. It's usually obvious. Like usually you listen to that music and you go, okay, that's the speed at which the scenery has to move. It also defines how long it can take. You'll listen to a musical tag or a vamp or something like that, and you'll say, okay, so this scene change, I've got 20 seconds for this because that's how long this tag of music is. So it's defining in that way. And then the sort of question of how much or how little to do for every scene depends a little bit on the style of the writing, I guess. But it also depends on how many scenes there are. The more different scenes there are, the more different locations there are in a story. And this is true whether it's a musical or a play, probably the less you're going to do for every scene, which is just, I mean, if for no other reason, there's the practical consideration. The more scenes there are, the less space you're going to have for each individual scene, the less money you're going to have for each individual scene. So sort of the more scenes there are, the simpler each one has to become. To the point where if there's so many, you may end up saying, you know what, it's not even worth having set changes, in this case. Because the other thing about set changes that I think are interesting, and I've sort of come to this point of view over many years, is that every transition takes a certain amount of energy from the show, from the audience, or requires a certain amount of energy from the audience. And so if the show is not moving quickly enough, if the story lags, having another transition there, while it can offer visual variety, it also, especially if it's a transition you've seen before, if you're going back to a place you've seen before, it runs the risk of making the event seem longer. Too many transitions can make a show seem slower or longer than it really is, because I think the audience becomes so aware of the time every time you make a transition. Unless you can make the transition incredibly exciting to watch. But if it's a transition you've seen, or if you're going back to the same place over and over again in the story, that's can be kind of tricky because the audience gets tired of it. They go, oh yeah, I've already seen this before. We're going back to that place again. So figuring out how to solve that is another thing, which is a reason why sometimes shows with an incredible number of transitions, you may just go, it's not worth it to change the set all the time. It's going to be lighter and more streamlined and easier on the audience if this is just done with sound and light. You know, if the physical space doesn't transform it, it's really just sound and light that tells us that we're gone to a new place.
Okay, well, to piggyback off that, how do you design for automation when you do have moving sets?
Well, I don't actually really know how, I'm not an expert on the mechanics of automation. I just know enough from having done it a bunch of times that, that if you want to make things slide sideways or track up and down stage, you usually have to put deck tracks in the floor, or you're going to have actors move them. Those are sort of your, basically your choices. Or you can make things turn. All of those things are possible. But I guess, in a musical, the thing that's most efficient in terms of space is having a bunch of tracks in the floor that can bring things on and off sideways, and at the same time have things that can fly up and down. I tend to think, watching a musical, that it's more interesting to see things go sideways than it is to. There's something so predictable about seeing pieces of scenery fly in and out that I think if you see too many fly transitions in a show, that's also sort of visually exhausting and tiresome. And so there's something, I don't know what it is. There's something about traveling sideways that implies travel that I think is useful in storytelling on stage. And so I try to do as much of that as possible, but obviously it's inevitable that if you've got a lot of transitions, you're going to have to fly things as well. But when you're thinking about what you're looking at in the transition, it's usually more interesting if you can be looking at the things that are moving laterally than the things that are moving vertically.
What's the most challenging show that you've worked on?
Oh my God. Usually the answer to that would be whatever I'm working on at that particular moment. I don't know. There's so many. That's a really hard question to answer. There's so many different things that can make something challenging. For me, ultimately, if the story doesn't really make sense, that's a challenge. I suppose if there are scenes that feel unnecessary to me when I read it, that's also a challenge, because it's really hard to design something when you feel like the scene is unnecessary or uninteresting. And so that's its own challenge. I don't think I'm going to answer your question with the title, but the budget is solving the budget is probably a challenge on every single show I've ever done. So it's a bigger challenge on some things than others. And sometimes solving the budget can seem like a hopeless problem, and that can be really demoralizing, because the budget is so small for a show that is so ambitious that it's just sort of depressing trying to figure out what's going to be left by the time you're done. I would tell you, as a designer, as an artist, one of the things that's I find particularly difficult is designing a Broadway production that you're really fond of, and then having to do the tour of it, because that really is a process of sort of sacrificing and eliminating things that you like. Because the truth is, on Broadway, even with a big budget set, the chances are you've had to fight for every single thing that's on stage already, even if it's a big budget, because budgets are just never enough. There's never enough money. So you're going to fight to get enough money to. You're gonna have to make cuts no matter what to get the show to sort of Broadway level, and then you do the show, and if all goes well, you kind of fall in love with what you've done a little bit, and then when you go to do a tour, you have to not only get rid of a lot of things, but you've also got to make everything that you did sort of less substantial. Things that were solid walls now suddenly have to become flimsy drops, and the thing that took 3 days to load in on Broadway now has to now has to load in an hour. I would say I'm in the middle of that right now with Moulin Rouge, which is a really particular challenge because it's we spent 7 weeks loading it in on Broadway, and so now we'll have a tour that takes 2 days to load it in. So that's, I think it's going to be good in the end, but it's not an easy process. I think for really anybody working on it, because in a way you wish you could just wish you could do that again. There it is. That's
well. Talk about Moulin Rouge, since it's the most recent show that has gone up that I know that you've done.
Yeah, sure. Well, obviously it's a really big, ambitious project. I worked on it for a long time. I guess by the time it opened on Broadway, I probably worked on it about 2.5 years. A year of that was basically the time between, we did it in Boston as an out-of-town tryout, and that was about a year before we did it on Broadway. And we did some work on it between Boston and Broadway. But there was a lot of developmental work. I saw a couple of table reads of the show early on, long before it went to Boston. And then we did a 6-week lab workshop of the show about 6 months before we went to Boston, and we did that at a scrappy little theater on the Lower East Side. But we actually built some scenery for that. I mean, it was certainly not like anything like the finished set, because the ceiling was only 12 foot high in this little theater. But we did start to get to establish some of the ideas of the look. We had some prop pieces, and we had basically the full story and the full orchestration. So it was incredibly useful for all the designers to have that lab, because it gave us an opportunity to really get to know the show before we had to finish the final design for Boston. Now, when we did that lab, because it was 6 months before Boston, the show was largely designed by then. The Broadway design was largely designed, but it was a chance to sort of make some last-minute tweaks to the design before they started building it for Boston. But one of the big challenges, for Moulin Rouge, is that it was such a beloved movie, especially by, I think, design geeks. It's one of those movies. Catherine Martin, who is Baz Luhrmann's wife, is the brilliant production designer and costume designer for all of his movies, including Moulin Rouge. And so, what she did for that movie was so incredible. And the energy of that movie was so incredible. Figuring out how to do that justice on stage, I would say was, at times an intimidating assignment. But, and there were things that the movie did that we couldn't do, obviously, like incredible panning shots and quick jump cut editing and stuff like that. You can't do that on stage. So, but that creates a lot of the energy of the movie. And so we were, one of the things that Alex Timpers and Justin Townsend, the lighting designer, and Catherine Zuber, the costume designer, and I all wanted to do was figure out how we could capture the incredible sort of almost manic energy of the movie. And, so there were a couple of things that we did in order to try to do that. One was to make the show as environmental as possible, so that a lot of it happens in the auditorium, and you get a sense of it happening all around you at times. That was one thing. Another was that I designed light bulbs and neon into as much of the set as I possibly could, so that there's really almost everything lit up at some point. And what that did was let us, especially during the really sort of high voltage musical numbers, be able to jump, to sort of light different parts of the set, almost instantaneously, either with electrics that light up or with different colors of light. And so that it almost felt like, some of those lighting shifts are so extreme that it almost feels like the scenery is moving during some of those songs. It's not. It's actually just sitting still during the songs. But I think it actually, the sort of lighting energy of that actually does make a big difference in terms of that kind of energy. And then the other thing that I did to try to capture some of the energy of the movie was to try to make the transitions, make the look of this different scenes somewhat eclectic, so that there's sort of different, in a way, there's sort of different visual styles happening in this. I don't know that I have pictures of everything here, but there are also some very graphic flat painted drops in the show. So what we're looking at right now, which is Toulouse-Lautrec Scarred, is very sort of decadent and rich and decayed. It's also, there's not much color in it. It's really sort of all shades of gray. Whereas the scenes in the club are really brightly colored. There's so much red and gold in the club. Or just go back down a little bit. That's the Elephant Love Medley, which is what ends Act 1, which is a much more sort of romantic, poetic, less real space, which is really a fantasy. But anyway, having these different styles. If you go up a little bit, if you go to Satine's apartment for a second, you'll see that is, there's no picture of it there. Maybe there's no picture. Well, I need to put a picture on my website for that. But it doesn't matter. It's a very sort of sumptuous, realistic set. So anyway, but my point is that the contrast in styles, and the contrast in looks and color, was really meant to try to make try to sort of increase the sort of amount of energy in the piece, so that the transitions themselves were a little bit startling when they happened. You never knew what to, like you didn't really know what to expect as you were going to the next scene.
It was a visual bombardment. Like you're right. It did capture the energy of the movie because it just never stopped. Like, right. Even if there was a down moment where, like, even at the Duke's Castle where it was nice and blue and you had that really long chase lounge there, it still had that energy. I felt like my heart raced almost the entire show. It's brilliant.
Thank you.
I like that you took it. The entire theater is draped in red velvet. It looks like, you know? So it was very immersive. I felt like that was one of the things that I really,
the red velvet came about in a kind of interesting way, because when we did it originally, before we agreed on doing the show, we did the Out of Town in Boston at the Colonial Theater. And so Alex Timbers and I, about a year before we went to Boston, flew up to Boston to go take a look at the theater to make sure it was okay for us. And we looked around, and the theater was painted red. The walls of the theater were all painted red. And we said, great, we can make this work for Moulin Rouge. And then about 6 months later, as they were beginning to do some advanced work up there, somebody sent me a photo and said, you know that the walls of the theater have now been painted green, right? And I did not know this. And I said, well, can we paint them back to red? And they said, no, because not only did they paint them green, now they're landmarked. Like, the green is now a landmarked color. It was some very expensive historical paint job, so they said they have to remain green. So, Alex and I were very distressed, because we said, you can't really do Moulin Rouge in a green theater. It doesn't make any sense. And so we said, could we cover the walls? And they said, yes, you can cover the walls. So I said, great, let's cover the walls with some red velvet. So then we, added up how many yards of red velvet we needed to cover the walls, and it was a lot. It was a lot of many yards. And so when we went to start ordering red velvet, we couldn't find enough red velvet to cover we couldn't find enough of one red velvet to cover the walls. In fact, we couldn't find 2 or 3 even with enough yardage. So I ended up having to use, I think it was 9 different fabrics in order to scrape together enough red fabric to cover the walls. So it was like, I don't know, 4 or 5 different types of velvet, and some satin, and some embossed velvet, and some brocade, and it all had to be cheap also, because it was, when you're buying that kind of yardage, you can't afford to buy expensive fabric. So it was all sort of cheap velvet and satin, and also had to be fire retardant, all of it. So it was a real challenge scraping together enough of this stuff to cover the walls. But it ended up being a really happy thing because it actually, I think it was much more interesting than if we succeeded in getting one type of fabric, because it gave it a lot more sort of energy and richness. And, you know, and part of the story of Moulin Rouge is that this guy, Harold Zidler, the impresario of the club, the producer, the owner of the club, never really had enough money. He like, you know, he was this, you know, incredible visionary producer, but he was basically like over leveraged to the hilt in building this thing. And he's always on the verge of bankruptcy. And so there's something about the, you know, about having all these different types of fabrics sort of patched together that, you know, it's, at first glance, it's rich and decadent. And then when you look a little more closely, it's a little sketch. So that ended up being a sort of good thing.
Can we talk about another play, a play set of yours that I love? And I want
Sure,
you
of course.
Okay, let's see. Let's go to this one. And I'm going to show it because I absolutely adore this set. And I want to know, like, do you design with the same lighting designer all the time? This blows me away.
Oh yeah, that was no. That well, Peter Kazarowski lit that. I don't get to work with the same lighting designer every time. There's a variety of reasons why it's different. He's one of my favorites. I love working with him. Actually, interestingly enough, there are two different lighting designers for the show, because this picture you've got here right now is London. So that was Neil Austin, who was a British designer who did that, British lighting designer. And then when we did it in New York, well, we did it in New York first. That was Peter Kazarowski. This was, you know, so this is Buried Child, and it takes place in southern Illinois. And, you know, it's a very kind of poor farmhouse. My research for this was I found some abandoned pictures of abandoned farmhouses in the Midwest, and that's what this ended up being based on. And there was some incredible sets with this amazingly, you know, old sort of Victorian or maybe 30s wallpaper, but it was really, really faded, really dirty. And then the floors in one of these pictures, of these pieces of research, had it was a wood floor that had old linoleum on it. And the linoleum had been glued to a wood floor, but the linoleum had so decayed that you started to see the floorboards poking back through the linoleum. And so that's what I did for the floor. Although we actually just used wallpaper on the floor because it was too hard to age the linoleum in the right way. So we just wallpapered the floor and then sanded over the joints just to sort of bring those out. And but the sense for this play is, you know, so they eventually find this buried, one of the characters goes and unearths a buried fetus that was buried in the backyard. And, but prior to that happening, he's also coming in from the backyard, finding all these vegetables that are just growing in weird abundance, corn and carrots and things like that are mysteriously growing in the back. And so what I wanted was the sense that the earth, the Illinois farmland was sort of beginning to take over this house, that there was a sense of like that the Illinois mud and dirt was beginning to sort of cast a patina across everything in this house: the floor, the walls, the ceiling, all of the furniture. It was a fun show to do.
I think, like, one of my favorite things, and I've seen a lot of your work, is the way that you utilize light coming in from the back of a set, like the window. I think that's a fascinating thing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I don't know. It's I guess it's nice, especially well, that's so Buried Child is sort of a realistic set. And I think it kind of wants to be a realistic set. There's a lot of stuff about the house in it, and about the mom being upstairs, and what's outside. The sense, that play, in particular, the sense of the outdoors, what's out there is very, very important. Of course, there's this buried child out there in the mud, but there's also the different people appear from outside into this little family household, and so I guess that's a part of it. But also I guess I like, the thing about having windows in the back is, and I certainly don't do it on everything, but I've done it on a bunch of shows, is it gives you a chance for incredible backlight to come at the actors, which I think, it can be really good. And even though Buried Child is sort of a realistic set, it's a very poetic play at the same time. And a very, it's funny, and it's also very, very grim. So having that sense of light, it also rains outside during that play. It's another play that rains outside. Having that sense of rain and mud and light coming directly, at the back of the actors, I think, because I think it makes a little bit, it lifts it out of the realism a little bit. It makes it feel a little bit more theatrical and a little more poetic.
No, I was saying that when you do have windows in the back and lights coming through, it's one of my favorite aspects of what.
Yeah, thank you.
Can we talk about the Oscars for just a second?
Yeah, of course.
I'm going to go to there.
Sure.
The Oscars. So how did you get involved with the Oscars?
Well, I did this production of How to Succeed in Business that Daniel Radcliffe was in, and two of the producers on that show, Neil Marin and Craig Zaden, went on to produce the Oscars. And I actually, when we did How to Succeed in Business, I wasn't actually sure if they liked me or not. I sort of had the sense they didn't like me. So I was very surprised when they called me, I read in Variety that they had just been hired to produce the Oscars. And literally the very next day I got a phone call from them. And they said that they wanted me to design the Oscars. And they mentioned a couple of sets that I had done, including the How to Succeed in Business, but they also mentioned I Am My Own Wife and 33 Variations as favorite designs of theirs. And what they said to me was, they said, we want you to design the Oscars, and we want you to design it with your aesthetic. It was kind of an amazing thing. They said, we don't think you should design it to look like what you think the Oscars should look like. We want the Derek McLane version of the Oscars that encompasses the aesthetic of I Am My Own Wife and 33 Variations, whatever that is. And actually, if you go to the 2013 year, which is a different show, I can show you what I did. Where is that? That's it. Yeah. So this was the very first time I did it and was working with them. It's interesting because on something like the Oscars, you really collaborate more with the producers than with the director. The producers are really in charge, and so it's kind of a little different than working in the theater. But so one of the things that I did is, you can see that proscenium that I made, that sort of arched proscenium. Because we were talking about some of the sets that I had done, that like 33 Variations, which had all these repeating objects in it. And they were saying how much they liked that. And so basically what I did was I made a proscenium with 1,000 Oscars in it, which is what that is. They're actually slightly larger than real Oscars, because when we were doing sort of camera tests, we came to the conclusion that a real Oscar would have been so small it wouldn't have really looked like much. So that's sort of where that idea came from. But then there's some other things in there that are sort of, if you scroll down, I think, well, there's light bulbs. There's all the, so I think we had 3,000 light bulbs on these aluminum rods, half of them coming out of the floor and half of them coming from above. And that was something we used for some of the show. Scroll down a little more and into the next image. Well, you can see some of the sort of repeating objects ideas in some of these things. I'm trying to see if there's one. Oh, that's good. That's got the close up of the proscenium. So that shows how the proscenium was made with these. So the Oscars were silver rather than gold, because it made them a little bit more mutable in terms of how we lit them. And we put light under every single one so that we could sort of uplight every one of those thousand Oscars there. Anyway, it was an exciting terrifying process for me, because I hadn't done much television, and certainly nothing on this scale before. And and sort of criticizing the Oscars is, I think, a national sport in America. And so I sort of entering that arena and knowing that you may be on the receiving end of some of that criticism is a little bit terrifying. But they were so supportive and amazing, Neil and Craig. Craig unfortunately passed away about a year ago, but they were really they had such incredible faith in me that it gave me confidence to be pretty bold in how I approach this. And so it was a great experience. That picture there, that one you're just scrolling into, it's a little hard to see, but there are racks of movie projectors in that one, which is something that was sort of also similar to the sort of idea of the 33 variation set. It was these kind of steel shells with movie projectors on them. Unfortunately, you can't really see it very well in that photo because it's such a long shot. But there was two of those, one on stage right and one on stage left, that sort of came together. And I can't remember. We might have had a total of like 40 movie projectors on them, but they were big. Like, we built them because they ended up wanting to be a little bit sort of chunkier than a real movie projector to sort of be seen.
I've taken up a lot of your time, but I have just two things. I want to look at 30. I want to look at 33 variations because that's the Tony winner, and then I want you to be thinking about. Tell my students what they need to be doing to maybe move into this this kind of work.
Yeah, absolutely. So 33 Variations is a play about Beethoven and a researcher who was researching Beethoven. The researcher was played by Jane Fonda, and it takes place in a variety of places, but the sort of central location is this archive in Bonn, Germany, which is what that photograph is there. And that's where all of Beethoven's stuff is archived in Bonn now. And so she's a contemporary researcher, goes there to try to look into why he wrote these pieces of music called the 33 Variations. He wrote 33 Variations were 33 different variations he wrote on a theme by Diabelli, who is a sort of a third-rate composer in Vienna. It's not the variation. The thing that Diabelli wrote is not significant. It's just catchy. It's a catchy piece of music. And Beethoven was commissioned to write 10 of these variations. He ended up writing 33 variations, and it's one of his great masterpieces. And what's sort of interesting about it was the way he riffed on this very simple little ditty, this little simple piece of music, and then came up with so many different, so many different things. And so I guess, I was trying to do a little bit of the same thing with the set, which is it took place in an archive in Germany, and the archive is one of the most boring things you've ever seen. When you look at it, it's just like, it's just a room in a basement with a bunch of archive boxes stacked up on them with pieces of music and notes in them. And so, but then I thought, well, what happens if I just sort of went crazy with that? If I went sort of completely insane with those boxes, and it's, probably in the real archive, there's probably 100 or 150 of these boxes. And I think that, I don't know if we had 4,000 of these boxes in the set, right? That's sort of what it became, was just thousands of these boxes, each with its own little light on it. And, they're so boring by themselves, but there's also something beautiful about seeing a kind of mundane object like that repeated over and over again. And then at the back of the set was sheet music. We had this kind of giant walls of hanging sheet music that was all replicas of Beethoven's handwritten sheet music. And there were thousands of that. And that sort of was what the set was boxes, gray archive boxes, and which are actually not all the same shade of gray. I think we had 5 different shades of gray that we used for those, and the sheet music. And then there was also sheet music. You can sort of see in that picture some shorter racks of sheet music that were only about 8 feet tall that were on the deck there. And those got moved around by actors, and they sort of fluttered beautifully when they moved because the bottoms of the pages were not fixed down, they were loose. And then there was also a drop that opened up at the very end. There was a waltz, what they do at the very end of the show. I don't know if there's a picture of the drop opening up at the end. There it is, which was basically a damask pattern, sort of enlarged, an enlarged damask pattern, which I ended up doing that for one of the Oscars too, for a kind of show curtain. But that was the only sort of relief from the archive was when we opened up and showed that damask, and that was sort of the one nod to Beethoven's period in the set. Everything else was contemporary. Even though Beethoven was a character, you can see Beethoven leaning against the table there. Beethoven and his assistant and the music publisher were all characters in this story.
That's fantastic. We know Moises Kaufman because we've done the Laramie Project at school.
Oh, fantastic! Yeah, beautiful play.
So we had to recreate all of the signs and things like that, and so that was really fun. So tell my students passing here what maybe they need to do, what do they need to study if they would like to design sets and do what you do.
Well, I would say draw every day, draw everything. It doesn't have to be pretty. You don't need to show it to anybody, but just learn. Drawing should become second nature for you. It should be, a writer has to know how to write, and a designer has to be able to draw. It's not that you need to create beautiful drawings, although that's helpful. Creating beautiful drawings is helpful at some point, when you're trying to persuade people, try to sell your work to people. When you're trying to persuade somebody to spend millions of dollars on a set, having beautiful drawings is helpful. But the other thing that drawing is really useful for is it's how you develop a design. And there is nothing faster and more immediate than being able to draw by hand. We can all do all sorts of amazing things on computers. We can do SketchUp, or we can do CAD, or we can do Photoshop, all those things, and they're all very useful tools. They will all be better if you can draw well by hand. You will be able to use any of those computer programs much better if you can draw well by hand. But the other thing is that you can draw, let's say that you want to work on an basic elevation for a set. Let's say you're doing, you want to kind of lay out a room like the room in the police station in American Son. You can draw by hand a version of that in 5 minutes. And then you can put it aside and you can draw another version in another 5 minutes. Now, it may not be a very beautiful drawing. It might not even be ready yet to show a director, but you can make 10 different versions of that easily in an hour, which are good enough for yourself to look at an idea. And then, if you've got a meeting with a director coming up, you can take 3 of those rough sketches and make them a bit better. And then you can actually start to have a conversation with somebody about what it is. And if you can draw handily enough, clearly enough, you can then, when you're sitting there with the director, redraw them. You can take those things, you can draw over them, you can draw a new thing, you can draw a new idea. Then again, it doesn't have to be beautiful, it just has to be clear. It has to be something that expresses the space. And there's nobody who can actually make drawings on a computer that quickly. It's just not possible. and and everybody starts working on a computer, myself included. I do this all the time. Goes into some rabbit hole of trying to make the computer do something that you want it to do. We've all done it a million times. I see my associates do it all the time. Sometimes I find them. I say, "What are you doing? What have you been doing for the last hour and a half?" And they go, "Oh, I'm trying to figure out how to get the computer to do this." And you go, "Like, forget that. Just pull out a pencil and a piece of paper and just draw it, because you know how to draw it." It's fast, it's immediate, and it's how you can improve a design most quickly. And so my suggestion would be to draw every day. Take whatever it is, doesn't matter what you draw on. It could be a legal pad. It could be, you could have it a journal, a sketchbook. A lot of people have those. I don't, but some people do, and they're great. And if you're waiting for a class to start, just draw the people sitting in front of you, or draw the classroom. Or if you're waiting at the airport to board a plane, draw the lounge that you're sitting in, departure lounge. Or draw, if you're sitting at a bus station, draw the bus station. If you see a building you like, do a really quick sketch, see if you can capture what's pleasing about that building. And it will develop your visual memory in a way that would be extremely useful. Try to make a habit of sketching rooms that you go to. If you go to visit somebody's house, if you go to visit your in-laws, if you go to visit your in-laws' cousin, take a look at that living room and try to remember it. It may be awkward to draw their living room, but if you're in the habit of drawing enough, you'll start to notice all these details. And then the next time you're called upon to design the living room of some really weird freak character, you can remember your in-laws' cousin. And you can say, that's it. That's what that room needs to look like. So developing that kind of visual memory, drawing helps that, but it also helps you get in the habit of looking at those things, because that's what we are as designers. We have to tell stories with those details. We have to learn how to define characters through the details of their lives. And so the more you can collect those, the better a designer you'll end up being.
Thank you so much for your time. I am so very thankful. And I hope that if I'm in New York sometime, you'll let me buy you a drink, maybe, if you have time for that.
That would be great. Come by my studio, and then we'll show you around, and then we'll go have a drink.
That would be amazing. That would be amazing. And so, Isla, thank you so much for joining us. I hope that this is good. If you'll send me an email through Derek, I will be happy to give you all of this. I'll pull the video and the audio both for you and make sure you have access to it. And Ben, thanks for sticking through this, man. My student Ben right there. So we're going to let you go, though, because we've gone way over what I told you. But it was so great, and thank you again so very much. Everybody, Derek McLane, thank you.
Nice to talk to you all. Take care.